my real-life ghost encounter years ago. I found myself living on the shores of Lake Erie, just outside Buffalo, New York. It was a sprawling estate, the kind with an old mansion, and plenty of history. The mansion was owned by a heart surgeon, and his wife, a wealthy couple who were often away, managing their many properties. I had just gone through a divorce and needed a place to call home, somewhere quiet and tucked away. That's when I rented the Carriage House, a building full of character and stories, despite its slightly decrepit state. The mansion sat closer to the lake, but my carriage house was nearer to the road, accessible via a private drive that cut across the estate. The house had been servants' quarters back in the early 1900s. Outside my door, there was an enclosed courtyard framed by the back of the house, a carriage barn from the horse and buggy days, a row of unused horse stalls, and a brick wall with an arched entrance. It was an amazing place to live. The rent was cheap, and the estate included a private 150-foot beach that I practically had to myself. But it was isolated, especially when no one was staying in the mansion. The neighbors were far off, as all the houses in the area were large, estates owned by part-time residents. Still, I loved the solitude. I was young, adventurous, and drawn to the eerie charm of the estate. One night, my quiet life took a turn I'll never forget. I was driving home late, around 1 a.m., after spending the evening at a friend's house. As I drove along a nearly deserted road about a mile or two from home, I noticed a figure standing near the roadside. It struck me as odd. This wasn't the sort of place where people lingered, especially not on a weekday night. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The figure was cloaked in something unusual, a black shroud-like garment that draped loosely over them, with part of it forming a hood. It reminded me of someone wearing an abaya and hijab, but this was far less structured, more like layers of fabric wrapped haphazardly. The figure stood stooped and still, their presence unnerving. I slowed my car, thinking perhaps they needed help. Maybe they were elderly, confused, or had wandered away from home. But as my headlights illuminated them, my stomach dropped. The figure raised their head, and I saw a face I recognized instantly. It was my ex-mother-in-law. I couldn't believe it. Her gray-brown hair, her familiar eyes, and that enigmatic smile. That always left me guessing. It was undeniably her. She even waved at me, not in a frantic or pleading way, but in a warm, almost reassuring manner. Here's the thing. My ex-mother-in-law had been dead for 3 years. The realization sent chills through me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I sped past her, too frightened to stop. My heart raced and my mind reeled. Could it really have been her? After driving for a few minutes, I started to calm down. Maybe I was imagining things? My mother-in-law had always been kind to me even after my rocky marriage to her son. Surely if she was reaching out to me from beyond, it wasn't for vengeance. Hesitantly, I turned the car around, retracing my route. But when I drove back down the road, she was gone. I didn't feel ready to go. Home to the carriage house, with its creaky century-old floors and whispers of history. Instead, I went to a local diner that stayed open all night. I sat there sipping coffee and trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. Eventually, I worked up the courage to head home. As I pulled into the courtyard, something felt wrong. My front door was open. I got out of the car, heart pounding, and walked closer. The glass panes on the door were shattered, and the wood was splintered, cracked almost in half. Someone had broken in. The next morning, I found a crowbar discarded in the courtyard, confirming my worst fears. Inside, the intruders hadn't taken much, just a jar of loose change, a few pieces of my clothing, which was deeply unsettling, and a knife from the kitchen. I didn't own much of value, but the thought of someone invading my space was terrifying. The isolation of the carriage house, once so comforting, now felt menacing. Whoever had done this had driven right into the courtyard, hidden from view, and methodically broken through my solid 100-year-old door. I called the police, but they never caught the culprit. Hours later, as the adrenaline subsided, I remembered the figure by the roadside, my mother-in-law. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had appeared to warn me, to delay me from coming home too soon. What if I had arrived while the intruders were still there? What if I had startled them, or worse, they had been waiting for me? I truly believe she saved me that night. These days I write fictional horror stories. I even published a ghost story novel, but this experience was no fiction. It happened, and it changed the way I see the world. So here's my advice. Be kind to your mothers-in-law. You never know when they might come back to help you, even from beyond the grave. Story 2, The Sigoglin, I'm not much of. a computer guy. But my nephew convinced me to share this story. He said it was too eerie to keep to myself, and offered to help me write it all down. This isn't just one story, it's part memory, part personal experience, and it all started with the tales my granny used to tell me when I was just a kid. My granny, or Meemaw as we called her, was a tough, God-fearing woman who never held back. When it came to scaring the hell out of me and my sister with her stories, most of them were about devils, demons, and other such things. Warnings meant to keep us on the straight and narrow. But one story stood out. It wasn't about hellfire or damnation, it was about something far more unsettling. She called it the Sagoglin. The name came from a word she used to describe things that looked off or crooked. It was her way of naming something she couldn't fully explain. The Sagoglin, she said, wasn't human, never had been. It was something else entirely, a thing that could disguise itself as people you knew, but never quite perfectly. There was always something wrong with it, something you could notice if you paid attention. My granny's story about the Sagoglin began shortly after her second husband, Hoyt, passed away. It had been about 2 weeks since the funeral. Late one night, in the middle of a fierce winter snowstorm, there was a knock at her door. She opened it, and there stood Hoyt. At first she thought she was seeing a miracle. It looked like him, right down to his clothes. But as he stepped into the glow of the house, she realized something was terribly wrong. He looked Sagoglin, she would say, shaking her head, as she remembered. His eyes were just a little too far apart, not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to unsettle her. His skin was smoother, unnaturally so, and he looked younger than he had in years. This wasn't the frail, wrinkled man she had buried. Then he spoke. "Don't worry, honey," he said, but the voice was wrong. It sounded strained, like it hurt him to force the words out. Granny described it, as though there was a groaning underneath. His voice and his lips didn't quite match the words. She realized this wasn't Hoyt. Granny, being the feisty woman she was, didn't wait to find out what it wanted. She started hitting it, shoving it with all her might. She said its skin was ice cold, but given the snowstorm, that wasn't surprising. What chilled her was the way it moved, stiff and unnatural, like someone wearing a poorly made mask. Of Hoyt, the creature didn't fight back. Instead, it stepped away and let out a sound Granny never forgot. She compared it to the creaking of an old door, low and moaning. She said it was a sound that didn't belong in this world. She slammed the door shut and locked it. The thing stayed outside for what felt like an eternity, just standing there in the snow. Finally, it turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the night. Granny said she didn't sleep a wink that night. Living out in a holler miles from town, with her neighbors snowed in, she had no one to call for help. She never saw the Sagoglin again, but she believed it could take on the appearance of others, switching disguises whenever it wanted. Years later, I had my own encounter. That made me wonder if Granny's story was more than just an old woman's tale. One night, after a late shift at work, I stopped at a gas station. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. Inside, a man stood at the counter, stiff as a board. The cashier was asking him to move, but he didn't respond. When the man finally turned, I got a good look at his face. Something wasn't right. His skin looked rubbery, almost fake, and his eyes, they didn't glisten. Like normal eyes, they were dry, like 2 lifeless marbles. I tried to ignore it, paid for my gas, and walked out. But the man followed me. I climbed into my truck and rolled down the window, trying to be polite. "Do you need help?" I asked. He looked at me with those strange, dry eyes and said, "All good." His voice was creaky, like it didn't belong to him. It sent a shiver down my spine. I drove off as fast as I could. The next day, I visited Granny in the hospital and told her what I'd seen. She didn't look surprised. She just reached out, pressed a finger to my forehead, and said, "Now you've seen it too." I've never been able to shake that encounter, and I'll never forget the way Granny's voice would lower when she talked about the Sagoglin. Maybe it's just a story, a way to keep kids in line, but the fear it instilled in me has always felt real. Now I share this tale in hopes that it'll give you the same chills it gave me. Granny was right about one thing: the Sagoglin is out there, and if you ever see someone who doesn't quite look or sound right, you'd best be careful. Story 3, The Scowling Child. Back in 2019, I experienced something that has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't a dream, a misunderstanding, or a trick of my mind. It felt real. I've shared this story with close friends and family, and though I still can't explain it, I know exactly what I saw. This all happened during a particularly dark time. My city had just endured a terrible tragedy, a mass shooting. Events like this were unheard of where I lived, and the shock of it rippled through the entire community. The incident happened only 3 blocks from my apartment, and the city went into lockdown. Many lives were lost, and even today, the memory of that time feels heavy. Work was canceled due to the tragedy, and everyone was on edge. My partner had plans to meet some friends that evening, and I ended up tagging along with one of his friend's girlfriends. Neither of us wanted to be alone. It was a small gathering, 6 of us, including my boyfriend, and we all spent the night drinking, smoking, and trying to process what had happened. None of us were strangers to drinking or smoking, but I'll say this up front, nothing like what I'm about to tell you has ever happened to me before or since, whether sober or not. We were hanging out in a small basement, flat attached to one of the friends' homes. Let's call him Friend A for clarity. This was my first time at Friend A's house, though I'd met him a few times before and knew a bit about his family. For example, his older sister often babysat young kids. Sometime during the night, Friend A's sister came downstairs, a small child trailing behind her. The boy couldn't have been older than 4 or 5, dressed in warm blue pajamas with brown plaid patterns. He was barefoot and scowling at us, clearly annoyed. She told us we were being too loud and that we were keeping everyone awake upstairs. Her tone was firm but not harsh, and it was easy to see why the kid was upset. I laughed it off, feeling a bit bad that we were disturbing their night. Being naturally anxious, I quickly apologized, as did the others, and we quieted down. The night wound down soon after, and we all went upstairs to sleep in the main part of the house. The next morning, as we sat around talking about the tragedy and the previous night, Friend A casually mentioned his sister coming down to tell us to quiet down. Someone joked about it not really mattering, since it was a Friday. That's when I brought up the boy. Oh yeah, I said it made sense that the kid was mad. He probably needed sleep. The room went silent. Everyone turned to me, confused. My heart started racing. I could feel my anxiety creeping in. What kid? Someone finally asked. The kid your sister was babysitting? I said, still thinking they must have just been too out of it to notice. Friend A frowned. She wasn't babysitting. Last night, I froze. Everyone was staring at me now, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. No, I insisted. There was a little boy with her. He had on blue pajamas, brown plaid, no shoes. My voice trailed off, as their faces shifted from confusion to discomfort. Friend A's sister was especially shaken. She swore up and down that there hadn't been any children in the house that night. None of them had seen the boy I was describing, and the more I tried to convince them, the stranger the situation became. But I know what I saw. The boy was as real to me as anyone else in that room. I can still picture him vividly. His blue, fuzzy pajamas, his small bare feet, and most of all, the scowl on his face. It wasn't an angry scowl. Not exactly. It was more like disapproval. I've thought about that boy so many times since then. Was he real? A ghost? Something else? I've wondered. If he was upset because we were drinking and talking after such a horrible tragedy, maybe thinking we were being disrespectful instead of just trying to cope. I wasn't scared of him, at least not at the time, but his scowl left me with an overwhelming sense of guilt, as though I'd done something wrong. To this day, I've never seen anything like it again. No one else at the gathering saw him that night, and no one in Friend A's family could explain it. I don't know what to make of it, but this is my story, exactly as it happened. Thank you for reading. Believe it or not, this is 100% my memory of the event. If you have any explanations, I'm open to hearing them. For now though, I'll always wonder about the scowling child. Story 4, real experiences I've had while working as a nurse in my mid-20s. I worked in a subacute rehab facility. For those unfamiliar, these facilities are meant to help individuals recover from significant injuries or surgeries, providing physical therapy and 24/7 nursing care. While most patients are there temporarily, regaining their mobility and independence. I worked in a specialized dementia unit, a place where long-term residents lived out the rest of their days. This unit wasn't limited to just dementia or Alzheimer's patients. We cared for individuals with a wide range of brain-related conditions, from strokes and traumatic brain injuries to brain tumors. Over time, the job became routine, but every so often, something would happen that I simply couldn't explain. Here are a few of my most unforgettable experiences. A disembodied hand. One evening, just after clocking in, I was standing at the end of the hallway, going over notes from the day shift nurse. My back was pressed against the wall. As I reviewed the details on my notepad, suddenly I felt something, a hand, or at least what felt like one, gently dragging its fingers across my abdomen. Startled, I jerked back, dropping my notepad. My eyes darted around, searching for whoever had touched me, but I was completely alone. It wasn't the brush of fabric or a stray gust of air. It was unmistakably the sensation of fingers. To this day, I can't explain what it was, but it left me uneasy for the rest of my shift. The call light symphony. If you've ever worked in healthcare, you know the sound of call lights is constant, a dinging reminder that someone needs assistance. However, in our unit, it wasn't unusual for call lights to go off in rooms that were completely empty. What made it even stranger was that these weren't isolated incidents. Some of these rooms didn't even have the call button cords plugged into the walls, yet the lights would flash, and the alarms would sound, forcing us to respond to phantom calls. It became such a regular occurrence that the staff just shrugged it off, but deep down I think we all felt unnerved. The empty room ghost at the very end of one hallway was a room that was never occupied. The heating and air conditioning system in that room was broken, making it unsuitable for patients. Instead, we used it as a private space for personal phone calls, a moment of peace, or even the occasional quick bathroom break. One evening, I stepped into that room's bathroom to touch up my hair and makeup. I left the door slightly ajar. As I worked fixing my bun in the mirror, out of nowhere, the bathroom door slammed shut behind me, with such force that it rattled the walls. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned and yanked the door open, expecting to see someone there. But the room was empty. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, no furniture, no curtains, nothing. The speed at which I opened the door left it. No time for anyone to slip out unnoticed. Whatever had slammed, that door wasn't human, of that I'm certain. The last farewell. One of our long-term residents was a middle-aged woman with severe Down syndrome. She was mostly nonverbal, though she occasionally managed to say a few words. She was incredibly sweet, always smiling, and loved watching cartoons. One evening, it was my turn to help her with dinner. She lacked the motor skills to feed herself, so I spoon-fed her while we watched TV together. But that night, she was acting differently. At first, I didn't notice. I was too focused on the cartoon playing on her screen. But then she started making noises, trying to get my attention. When I finally turned to her, she was grinning ear to ear, pointing excitedly at the corner of her room. I followed her gaze, but the corner was empty. Still, she kept pointing, giggling, and even waving at whatever she thought was there. I asked her questions, simple yes or no ones, but she couldn't explain. Her behavior made me uneasy. She was clearly seeing something I couldn't. After finishing her meal, I stepped out into the hallway and was immediately approached by another nurse. My stomach dropped as she informed me that the woman's next-door neighbor had passed away during dinner. The window watcher, this story isn't mine, but was shared with me by a fellow nurse, Mary. It happened years before I joined the facility. Mary had a special bond with one of her patients, an elderly woman named Emily. Emily had no living family and was often lonely, so Mary went out of her way to make her feel cared for. Emily would wait by her room's window, which faced the employee parking lot, to wave at Mary as she arrived for her shift. It became a cherished ritual. Every morning and evening, they'd exchange waves, an act that brought Emily so much joy. Then one day, Emily fell ill and couldn't get out of bed. For weeks, Mary would arrive at work, hoping to see her patient at the window, only to find it empty. But one morning, as Mary pulled into the parking lot, she saw Emily standing at the window again. Thrilled, Mary hopped out of her car and waved enthusiastically. Emily, however, didn't react. She just stood there, motionless, watching. Confused, Mary hurried inside, eager to check on her patient. That's when she learned that Emily had passed away earlier that day. Final thoughts. Working in the dementia unit wasn't easy, but it gave me experiences I'll never forget. Some were heartwarming, others chilling, but all of them reminded me that life and whatever comes after it is full of mysteries. Thank you for taking the time to read these stories. I hope you found them as intriguing as I did living through them. Story 5, Noping Out on My Dirt Bike. Growing up in a small rural town on the Sunshine Coast. In Queensland, Australia, I was lucky to have access to 156 acres of dense bushland right in my backyard. My stepdad had carved out trails for me and my siblings, and they became our personal playground. I'd spend countless hours riding my dirt bike, exploring every nook and cranny of that land. Being out there alone never fazed me. If anything, it was my favorite thing to do. I'd grab a swag, pack a backpack full of snacks, and head out to find some secluded spot to camp out for the night. It felt like my own version of Teen vs. Wild. There was never any real danger, no predators to worry about, and most animals would scatter at the sound of my bike. But one evening, everything changed. It was around 7:30 p.m., the middle of summer. The sun was still up, casting a warm glow over the trails, so I figured I had a few hours of daylight to enjoy a ride. One of my favorite trails had a fallen tree across it, which I'd have to stop and lift my bike over each time. It was a minor inconvenience, but nothing that ever deterred me. That evening, though, when I reached the tree, an overwhelming feeling of unease washed over me. It was as if someone or something was glaring at me with intense, burning hatred. My skin prickled, and every hair on my body stood on end. I stopped, looking around, but there was nothing, just the familiar trees and bushes. I shook it off, telling myself I was being irrational, probably hyped up from too many energy drinks. There wasn't a soul for miles. But then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me, deep in the tree line. My heart started racing. I scanned the area again, straining to see through the dense foliage, but still nothing. Yet the feeling of danger intensified, like I wasn't alone. My voice wavered as I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. Just the sound of more twigs snapping, moving around me. And then I heard it, a voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft, eerie whisper coming from just beside me. "Help me." But here's the part that sent chills straight through my soul. It wasn't one voice. It sounded like two little girls speaking in perfect unison. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. My hands trembled as I gripped the handlebars of my bike, but before I could process what was happening, the sound came again, louder this time, without thinking. I yanked my bike over the log and gunned it. My tires kicked up dirt as I tore down the trail, riding faster than I ever had in my life. But just as I thought I was putting distance between me and whatever that was, a bone-chilling shriek pierced the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, half human, half machine, like a person screaming in harmony with the screech of a massive truck's brakes. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I kept going, the sound echoing behind me, until I reached the far side of the property. I didn't even stop. When I hit the barbed wire fence, I pushed my bike through it, tearing my clothes in the process, and sped down the dirt road all the way home. When I finally stumbled through the door, breathless and shaking, the only person I told was my little brother. His response? He laughed, called me a liar, and brushed it off. I didn't bother bringing it up again. It took me a long time to work up the courage to ride those trails again, and even then I avoided that specific one for months. When I eventually did, nothing out of the ordinary happened, and it's been quiet ever since, but that night still haunts me. The voice, the shriek, the overwhelming sense of dread. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe an animal, but nothing I come up with feels right. What do you think it could have been? If you've got any ideas, I'd love to hear them, because every logical explanation I've considered falls short.